your host. My next guest is a journalist. He is a former speechwriter for Bernie Sanders. He is the author of a new piece on his Substack chain that perhaps the cynics among us have been anticipating for some time. David Sirota, again, journalist and former speechwriter. First of all, David, thanks for coming back on the program.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you, and I hope you've been well. So in my introduction, I said the cynics among us may have been anticipating a headline like the one that I just saw on Sirota.substack.com, TMI, too much information. The headline, will Big Pharma fleece us on a COVID treatment that we helped fund, ? Was I too cynical to think that this was actually something that was, if not close to inevitable, certainly predictable? Let's start there. Let's go into the details. Am I a cynic?
No, I mean, look, the pharmaceutical industry has managed to make outsized profits, not just normal profits, but outsized profits compared to the rest of the world here in the United States, because it's been able to essentially buy our political system and put in place laws that allow it to profiteer off of the healthcare system and and medicine. So I don't think you can be too cynical about the pharmaceutical industry and its political power here in the United States.
Fair statement, I would say. Now, what you're talking about here in your piece, David, is specifically remdesivir, and you address both the history of it and then this kind of ideology, which we'll get to maybe after that. But let's start with the history of remdesivir. As you highlight in an illustration, it was developed. This is, well, you tell us. You tell us about remdesivir, if you don't mind.
Sure. Let's first start with Jonas Salk, so we can start at a reference point that a lot of people know of. Jonas Salk was the guy who essentially developed the polio vaccine, and he very, very famously decided not to patent the polio vaccine because he said it was a public good, and also he said that he didn't want to make the public pay twice for that medicine. And what he meant by that was that the development of the vaccine was funded essentially by contributions to the March of Dimes and other charitable organizations, and so he felt like it was wrong to try to reap massive private profits off of not only something that the public needed to be widely accessible, but also something that the public effectively had funded before. So keep that principle in mind when we talk about this potential coronavirus treatment, because that's what's at issue here. In the spirit of Jonas Salk, there used to be a law on the books, a rule, during the George H.W. Bush administration, which said that medicines developed at taxpayer expense should be offered to taxpayers at a fair and reasonable price. The idea is that the public should not have to pay exorbitantly twice for a medicine that it helped essentially develop. You hear drug companies all the time say that they need to charge high prices in order to recoup and recover the money that they spent on developing drugs. What they don't say is that many, if not most, of the major medicines that come to market have been originally funded in part by the taxpayers themselves. I think there was a study from 2016 that found 200 plus FDA-approved drugs. All of them had received some form of government funding. So that used to be a rule on the books. That rule was killed by the pharmaceutical industry in Congress. I should say that the Clinton administration repealed it. Congress tried to put it back. And the effort to put it back was killed in Congress by the Republicans and a handful of Democrats. One of the Democrats, I should add, was Joe Biden, who voted to kill that legislation. It was legislation by Bernie Sanders and Paul Wellstone. So now all of that is prelude to where we are now. The drug that you mentioned that has shown some promise, although it's not conclusive, but some promise in treating the coronavirus situation, was a drug that was originally developed with taxpayer money. And that includes money from NIH sources, federal sources, also research at publicly funded public universities. The problem is that reasonable pricing rule is no longer on the books, which means that if this medicine ends up being the medicine we need to deal with the crisis, there is very little on the books to prevent the private for-profit drug company that has control over the drug from essentially charging us whatever it wants to charge us for a drug that we may need. This explains why the HHS secretary, Donald Trump's HHS secretary, by the way, himself a former pharmaceutical executive, went before Congress and said and would not pledge to make sure that any coronavirus treatment is affordable. He was insisting that we can't do price controls, not mentioning the fact that we used to have on the books this rule that would say that if a medicine is developed if we, the taxpayers, paid for it, we shouldn't be fleeced on it.
So, David, David Sirota, you made a lot of great points there, and I think they're very important. One little thing, just my little red flag went up. Well, you mentioned Joe Biden voting against preserving this rule. You said the Clinton administration killed this rule,
Right.
and so this was what by squashing a regulation or just issuing an executive order.
The head of the NIH at the time, the head of the NIH in 1995 rescinded the rule under Bill Clinton and Donna Shalala at HHS. They just simply rescinded the reasonable pricing rule. Now, their argument was that the reasonable pricing rule was creating a financial disincentive for pharmaceutical companies to work with the federal government. But if you think about how perverse that is, the insinuation is that the pharmaceutical companies will only work and take federal money, money that the pharmaceutical companies don't have to spend. Apparently, they will only take it if they are still allowed to fleece us on the end product of the drugs that we invested to develop. That's the key point here. The idea of that rule was that if the American taxpayer is investing in a drug, the return on the investment doesn't need to be profits to the federal government. It simply needs to be a fair and reasonable price, and at minimum, not a price that is higher than what the drug companies are charging people in the rest of the world who didn't fund the development of that drug.
And we're obviously being charged more than people in the rest
Correct.
of the world. There's
In
solid
many
data
cases,
on that. Again, we're talking with journalist David Sirota about the possibility, the likelihood that we will get fleeced on a COVID treatment, specifically remdesivir, if it turns out to be effective. And now, David, it seems to me that there are couple elements to the production of any pharmaceutical, or for that matter, any piece of what you might call intellectual property, right? Which is, if I invent an anti-gravity machine, then I hold the patent on the anti-gravity machine, and somebody maybe wants to manufacture it. They can pay me to, access my patent, or I can say, well, give me like at the cost to manufacture plus 5%. All the anti-gravity machines you can make. But in this case, it's the American people. In this case, it's not an anti-gravity machine. It's not just this drug, but hundreds of pharmaceuticals where the intellectual property part, the invention, has been done by the American people in one form or another. And what you're saying, and what studies have shown, is that the American people, having subsidized the knowledge and created the discoveries, are then turning over the simple mechanics of the process of manufacturing this and treating the manufacturer, or should be doing it at cost plus or whatever, which would be, in many cases, would be pennies, and treating them as if they and not we had paid for the creation of that, which is, a product of a corrupt political system, not a rational manufacturing process. Am I overstating the case?
No, I mean, I think it's slightly oversimplified in this sense, which is that the drug companies oftentimes are working in tandem with the federal government. So, and it's not that the drug companies are just sort of putting it into a factory and producing it. I mean, I don't want to understate their role as well. But the point here is that the federal government is oftentimes specifically sponsoring the original research and development. And by that, I mean the research and development at the early stage in the process that is, from an investment perspective, the highest risk form of investment. It's the equivalent of, like, if you use an analogy to drilling for oil, it's like, the stage of drilling for oil where you're just drilling holes all over the place, and you're going to come up with a lot of dry holes. The federal government is particularly sponsoring that basic research, the kind of basic research that for-profit corporations are hesitant to invest in because they know it can be a dry hole. It can be the kind of research where you strike out a lot before you actually succeed.
So what we're talking about here is, and I appreciate that, refinement of what I said, but, for example, I did a piece on a potential Zika vaccine where the U.S. Army paid the drug company to do the research and then gave the patent to the drug company. So
right,
we
exactly.
had this.
That's the dirty deal, right? The point here is that if the federal government is investing, and in specific, if the federal government is investing in the highest risk part from an investment perspective, the highest risk part of the process, the idea is that the federal government should get the return on its investment on behalf of the public should be that when they license the drug for production, for manufacture, when they license that patent to and the exclusive license to a company, as opposed to giving it to many companies, that at least the federal government and the taxpayers, the public, should get back as a return on its investment a fair and reasonable price. And that is not obviously what we are getting in many cases.
So, and again, we're talking to journalist David Sirota about a potential whether we'll get fleeced on a COVID treatment. And David, I don't know how else to broach this. You then link to a kind of ideological defense of this predatory industry. I got to tell you, I just got to fess up. I saw this column by Bret Stephens in the New York Times story of remdesivir with the subtitle, "Just as there are no atheists in foxholes, there should be no big pharma haters in pandemics." And I'm glad you took it on, because my reaction was, I can't deal with this right now. I can't process this. But it
was incredible, right? I mean, he's a conservative columnist for the for the New York Times. And what was really incredible about it was he was portraying this particular medicine as a great success story of the free market and the private sector, when in fact it is almost literally the opposite. If it ends up succeeding, it would be a great success story of federal government involvement in the economy, specifically in the development of a medicine or a treatment that we all need as a public and as a world. So what's really Orwellian about what the New York Times published was, how do you write a story about a drug, calling it a private sector, pure private sector, free market success story, without ever once, not even once, mentioning that the federal government and the taxpayers, the public sector, funded in part the research and development of this drug. It's incredible.
It really is, David Sirota, and obviously we don't have time to go into the in-depth media criticism, but doesn't anybody fact check this stuff? I mean, are you allowed, if you get that slot, that coveted slot, to just say any damn thing, and it doesn't have to be remotely accurate? It's not fair for me to ask you, because we only have a minute.
I think it's a fair question, and I think this is I find to be kind of the most insidious kind of deception, where it's the facts that are published are not necessarily in dispute. I mean, there were things that were said in that column that were factual unto themselves. It's dishonesty and deception by omission. You can say, here's A, B, and C fact, and A, B, and C fact may be true, but if you don't provide D, E, and F fact about the context, then you can tell us an entire story about A, B, and C without actually telling the real story. That's the real insidious part of this, is that if you fail to mention facts that may be inconvenient to your narrative, you are effectively, as this is an example of, you are effectively deceiving your readers in a very active way. I mean, readers can walk away from that column and think, hey, it's true. Like the pharmaceutical industry is a great free market success story. We got to get the government out of the way of the economy. And these people who criticize the pharmaceutical company, I mean, they're crazy, they're bad. If you leave out the part of the story that we've just discussed, people can come to that conclusion. But that's the problem. That conclusion is based on a not complete set of facts.
Right, which is, an incomplete set of facts is as you say, its own form of deception, which is why I'm glad you wrote this piece, David Sirota. And I would assume, before I let you go, and also, of course, thanks for coming on the program, I would assume that people who want to read more of your work should go to sirota.substack.com. Is that correct?
That's right. Or they can just Google my name, and it's right on the front of my own website, which is davidsirota.com.
All right. Well, David Sirota, thanks for the great work on this. Thanks for coming on the program, and best of luck going forward.
Anytime. Thanks for your work as well. Thanks again.
Thanks, man.